The menu struck the table with a sound like a dry branch snapping. It was a sharp, deliberate crack that sliced through the hushed symphony of the dining room, the gentle clinking of silver on porcelain, the murmur of discreet conversations, the distant, romantic sigh of a cello from the live quartet in the corner. Elara Vance, 20 years old and 4 hours into a 10-hour shift, didn't flinch. Her posture remained a perfect, straight line, a testament to months of training and a lifetime of self-control. To the other patrons of the Gilded Quill, Manhattan's century-old temple of gastronomy, she was just another part of the immaculate decor, a slim figure in a starched black uniform, as functional and unobtrusive as the crystal water glasses. But to the man who had just weaponized the wine list, she was an obstacle, an annoyance, a non-entity who was taking 3 seconds too long to materialize at his elbow. "Are you deaf or just slow?" he boomed, his voice a vulgar cannon blast in the refined chamber. "I've been trying to get your attention for a full minute." Elara turned, her face a carefully composed mask of polite neutrality. She looked at the man, Sterling Blackwood, a real estate developer whose face was plastered on billboards across the 5 boroughs, usually with a shark-like grin and a slogan about conquering the skyline. In person, his skin had the ruddy, porous texture of a man who lived on steak and outrage. He wore a watch that cost more than her college tuition, a chunky gold monstrosity that seemed to scream its price tag from his wrist. Beside him, his fiancée, Tiffany, a woman who looked like she'd been assembled from a catalogue of expensive cosmetic procedures, sniffed disdainfully at her bread plate. To everyone in the room, it was a familiar, if unpleasant, tableau. A wealthy, arrogant patron belittling the staff, an open and shut case of power imbalance in a place built on the very concept of a service class. But what the sneering developer and his plastic partner didn't know, what even the nervous manager hovering by the service station didn't know, was that the quiet man sitting alone in the corner booth, the man they had all dismissed as a dreary, middle-aged tourist, was the one who held the deed to every brick and every bottle in this establishment. And he was watching, he was listening, and he was about to witness a quiet, unassuming waitress dismantle an empire of arrogance with a weapon no one expected: the truth. The Gilded Quill was not merely a restaurant, it was a living museum. Opened in 1908 by the industrialist Alistair Croft, it had survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, Prohibition, and the relentless march of culinary fads. Its walls, panelled with dark, lustrous mahogany imported from a forgotten jungle, had absorbed the secrets of presidents, mobsters, and movie stars. The air itself felt heavy with history, scented with beeswax, old leather, and the ghost of 1,000,000 celebratory cigars. Elara loved this history more than the job itself. She was a history major at Hunter College, working 60 hours a week to pay for her classes. During her 30-minute breaks, she didn't scroll through her phone. She sat in the staff locker room with a dog-eared library book, reading about the Gilded Age, about the very tycoons who had once sat in these velvet booths, making and breaking fortunes over plates of terrapin soup. She knew, for instance, that the bar top was carved from a single piece of rosewood salvaged from a Vanderbilt yacht, and that the chandelier had been custom-made in Prague and had to be lowered by a special crank system for cleaning, a process that took 2 full days. This knowledge was her private comfort, a secret connection to the soul of the building that no rude customer could ever touch. "I'm sorry for the delay, sir," Elara said, her voice soft but clear, devoid of the tremor Blackwood seemed intent on provoking. "How can I assist you?" "You can start by getting me a real bottle of wine," Blackwood sneered, tapping a thick, manicured finger on the leather-bound tome. "This list is adequate. For amateurs. But I'm celebrating. We just closed on the Astor Building, a $1 billion deal. I need something that reflects the occasion. Something with a story. Something you've probably never heard of. He was testing her, baiting her. He wanted her to be intimidated, to stammer and fetch the sommelier. It was a game he played, asserting his dominance in tiny, cruel increments. "We have an extensive cellar, sir," Ilara replied, her gaze steady. "Our sommelier, Mr. Dubois, would be happy to—" "No, no, no," Blackwood cut her off, waving a dismissive hand. "I don't want to talk to some French guy who'll try to upsell me on this year's trendy swill. I want you to tell me what your best bottle is. Let's see what they teach the help these days." This was a trap. Recommending a wine was Mr. Dubois' job. If she overstepped, she could be reprimanded. If she refused, she'd be insubordinate. From the corner of her eye, she saw her manager, a perpetually anxious man named Mr. Davies, wringing his hands. He gave her a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head, begging her not to engage. But Ilara was not just a waitress. She was a historian, and this was her museum. "Our best bottle is a subjective question, sir," she said carefully. "It depends on your palate. However, our most historically significant bottle is the 1887 Chateau d'Yquem. It was part of the original collection, curated by our founder, Alistair Croft, for the restaurant's opening. It survived prohibition by being hidden in a false wall in the cellar, a story that was confirmed by his grandson a few decades ago. There are only 3 known bottles of that vintage left in the world. The detail was effortless, the delivery calm. She wasn't showing off. She was answering the question. Blackwood was momentarily silenced. He had expected a fumbling response, not a history lesson. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face before he quickly masked it with a condescending smirk. "Cute story," he said, "but I'm in the mood for a red. A big red. A Bordeaux. What about a 1945 Mouton Rothschild? The Victory vintage. I'll take that." He said it with the casual arrogance of a man ordering a Coke, but it was a request of staggering proportions. The 1945 Mouton was a legend, a wine that commanded auction prices upwards of $20,000 a bottle, if one could even be found. "An excellent choice, sir," Ilara said, her face betraying nothing. "I will have Mr. Dubois confirm if we have it in the cellar and present it for your approval." She retreated from the table with a quiet grace, her back straight, her steps measured. She did not look at the man in the corner, but she felt his eyes on her. Julian Croft, grandson of Alistair Croft, sat motionless. He had come here unannounced, a secret shopper in his own legacy. For months, he had been hearing whispers of declining standards, of staff morale plummeting, of the soul of his family's institution being eroded by a new, crass form of wealth. He had come to see for himself if the Gilded Quill was still a bastion of timeless elegance, or if it had become just another expensive restaurant for bullies like Sterling Blackwood. His initial impression had been grim. The manager, Davies, was clearly terrified, and the sommelier seemed more interested in preening than in service. But the waitress, she was different. She had a quiet dignity, a surprising depth. He adjusted his simple, wire-rimmed glasses and continued to watch. This was becoming more interesting than he had anticipated. Mr. Davies intercepted Ilara near the kitchen doors, his face pale with sweat. "What are you doing?" he hissed, his voice a frantic whisper. "Just give him what he wants. Don't provoke him. That's Sterling Blackwood. He could buy this place and fire us all for fun." "He asked me a question, Mr. Davies," Ilara said calmly. "I answered it. He's requested the 1945 Mouton. I was on my way to inform Mr. Dubois." The 45? Davies's eyes widened in panic. We have one bottle. It's the crown jewel. It shouldn't even be on the list. It's a museum piece. What if he says it's corked? What if he doesn't like it? A man like that will refuse to pay, and the cost will come out of our operating budget. A man like that is ordering it precisely because it's the most expensive and difficult thing he can think of, Ilara stated, a hint of steel entering her voice. It's not about the wine, it's about the performance. Davies just shook his head, muttering about profit margins and bad reviews. Ilara left him to his anxieties and found Jean-Luc Dubois, the sommelier. Dubois was a man who looked the part, with slicked-back silver hair and a haughty demeanor, but Ilara knew he was more style than substance. His knowledge was a veneer, polished but thin. When she relayed the order, a flicker of the same panic she'd seen in Davies crossed his face. The 45 Mouton, Dubois breathed, his French accent thickening with stress. Mon Dieu, it is a delicate operation. The retrieval of the wine was a ceremony in itself. Davies, Dubois, and a junior waiter descended into the chilled, cavernous cellar, a catacomb of brick and stone that smelled of damp earth and angel's share. The single bottle lay in a specially padded cradle in a locked alcove known as the vault. Davies handled it like it was an unexploded bomb, his hands trembling as he placed it in a velvet-lined carrier. Back in the dining room, the presentation began. Dubois approached Blackwood's table with the funereal gravity of a pallbearer. He presented the bottle, its label faded and stained with age, the iconic V for victory, drawn by the artist Philippe Julian, still faintly visible. The 1945 Chateau Mouton Rothschild, Dubois announced, his voice trembling slightly. Blackwood barely glanced at it. Yes, yes, get on with it, he said, waving his hand impatiently. Open it. I haven't got all night. The ritual of opening an ancient wine is one of surgical precision. Dubois carefully cut the foil capsule, his hands surprisingly steady. He inserted the long, thin prongs of an arceau corkscrew, designed to extract fragile old corks without breaking them. The cork came out with a soft, breathy sigh. It was intact. A collective, unspoken exhalation of relief went through the staff watching from the periphery. Dubois poured a small tasting measure into a crystal glass and swirled it gently. He sniffed, his eyes closed in concentration. He took a tiny sip, letting it coat his palate. He nodded slowly, a look of profound relief on his face. It is magnificent, he declared, still very much alive. Notes of cassis, cedar, and history itself. He poured a glass for Blackwood, who picked it up immediately, sloshing the dark liquid. He stuck his nose in the glass, inhaling theatrically. Ah, yes, he said loudly, playing to the room. Graphite, cigar box, a hint of mint, a truly spectacular nose. He took a large gulp, swallowing it almost immediately. Perfection. The kind of thing you only appreciate when you've reached a certain level. Leave the bottle. Ilara, standing by her service station, felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Something was wrong. Terribly, fundamentally wrong. It wasn't a hunch. It was a certainty born from hundreds of hours spent staring at archival photographs and reading historical texts. She had spent a full week of her winter break studying the wines of the 1940s for a paper on post-war European economic recovery. She knew that vintage. She knew its story, its chemistry, its very soul, and the bottle on Sterling Blackwood's table was an imposter. It was a masterful fake, but it was a fake nonetheless. There were two details, tiny and insignificant to a layman, but glaringly obvious to her. The first was the capsule, the foil covering the cork. The original 1945 Mouton had a short, lead-based capsule, typical of the wartime shortages. The one Dubois had just cut was longer, shinier, with a slightly different texture, a tin and aluminum blend that wasn't widely used until the late 1950s. The second, more damning detail was the color of the wine in the glass. A 70-plus-year-old Bordeaux, even a magnificent one, would show its age. It would have a brownish, brick-red hue at the rim, a phenomenon known as bricking. The wine in Blackwood's glass was a deep, vibrant ruby all the way to the edge. It was the color of a wine, perhaps 20, maybe 30 years old. Not 78. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a scandal. It meant that the most prized possession of the Gilded Quill, the bottle that had lain in its vault for decades, was a counterfeit. And the sommelier, the supposed expert, had either not noticed or was too afraid to admit it, and the billionaire buffoon was too ignorant to tell the difference. Ilara's mind raced. What should she do? Her duty was to her employer, to the integrity of this historic place. But her instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to stay silent. Davies would fire her on the spot. Blackwood would crucify her. She would be the waitress who ruined a billion-dollar celebration over a conspiracy theory. She looked at Mr. Davies, who was now beaming, relieved that the crisis was averted. She looked at Dubois, who was accepting congratulations from a nearby table for his masterful handling of the legendary bottle. They were all complicit in a lie, whether they knew it or not. Then she looked at the man in the corner. Julian Croft was no longer looking at her. He was staring at the wine bottle on Blackwood's table, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. He held his own glass of simple house Cabernet up to the light, his brow furrowed in thought. He knew, or at least, he suspected. He was the grandson of the man who had bought that wine. It was his family's legacy that was being desecrated. In that moment, Ilara made a decision. She was not just a servant in this house. She was its custodian. She took a deep breath, straightened her apron, and began to walk towards Sterling Blackwood's table. Every step felt like she was walking off a cliff. The low hum of the dining room seemed to fade away until the only sound was the frantic beating of her own heart. This was it. She was about to interrupt the most powerful man in the room and tell him he was a fool, drinking a lie, and she was going to do it in front of everyone. The air around table 12 crackled with a self-congratulatory energy. Sterling Blackwood was holding court, his voice rising as he poured another generous glass of the fraudulent Mouton for himself and a smaller one for Tiffany, who looked at the dark liquid with bored indifference. "You see, this is what separates the men from the boys," Blackwood pontificated, swirling the wine with a clumsy, exaggerated motion. "Anyone can buy an expensive car. But to appreciate a piece of history like this, it takes a certain pedigree, a refined palate." He took a sip. "The finish is endless, just endless, like the view from my new tower." Ilara arrived at the table, a silent spectre in black and white. She stood for a moment, waiting for a pause that she knew would never come. She had to cut in. "Excuse me, Mr. Blackwood," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it had the density of a stone dropped into a still pond. The ripples of silence spread outward from the table. Blackwood stopped mid-sentence, his glass halfway to his lips. He glared at her, his eyes narrowing. "What? What is it now? Did you forget the butter? Can't you see I'm in the middle of a toast?" "My apologies for the interruption, sir," Ilara said, her hands clasped behind her back to hide their trembling. "But I have a concern regarding the wine." A collective gasp was audible from the staff station. Mr. Davies looked as though he might faint. Mr. Dubois, the sommelier, who was schmoozing a table of tourists, froze mid-anecdote. Tiffany rolled her eyes so hard it seemed to require a conscious effort. Oh, for God's sake. Is she the wine police now? Blackwood's face began to flush, the colour rising from his thick neck. A concern? What kind of concern could you possibly have? This wine is perfect. The sommelier said it's perfect. I say it's perfect. End of story. With all due respect, sir, Ilara pressed on, her voice unwavering despite the storm gathering in his eyes. I believe this bottle may not be authentic. The word hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Not authentic. Silence. A deep, profound silence fell over the entire dining room. The string quartet faltered, a violin squeaking into an awkward pause. Diners at other tables turned in their seats. This was no longer just dinner. It was theatre. Blackwood slowly placed his glass on the table. The look on his face was one of pure, unadulterated fury. He didn't look at Ilara. He looked past her, searching for her manager. "Davies!" he roared, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "Get over here, now!" Mr. Davies scurried to the table, his face the colour of spoiled milk. He was bowing before he even arrived. "Mr. Blackwood, sir, I am so terribly sorry. I don't know what's gotten into her. Ilara, apologize to the gentleman, and go back to the kitchen immediately." "She's not going to the kitchen," Blackwood snarled, finally turning his venomous gaze on Ilara. "She's going out the front door. She's fired. But first, she's going to explain this little accusation. You think this wine is a fake?" He spat, the word dripping with contempt. "You, a $20 an hour nobody, are accusing this restaurant, and by extension me, of being involved with a counterfeit? On what grounds? Your vast experience sipping boxed wine in your studio apartment?" The cruelty was designed to shatter her, to make her cry and crumble. But Ilara stood her ground. She had crossed the Rubicon. There was no going back. "On the grounds of historical fact, sir," she said, her voice gaining strength. "The capsule on the bottle is a tin aluminum blend, not used by the chateau until 1957. The original 45 vintage used a short lead capsule due to post-war material shortages. Furthermore, the wine in your glass has a deep ruby color. A genuine wine of this age would show significant bricking, a brownish tint at the rim. This wine appears to be no more than 30 years old at most. It is an excellent wine, I'm sure, but it is not the 1945 Mouton Rothschild." Every word was a hammer blow of precision. She wasn't emotional. She was academic. It was this cool, factual delivery that made the accusation so devastating. She had not offered an opinion. She had presented evidence. Blackwood was momentarily stunned into silence by the specificity of her claims. He looked at the wine in his glass, then at the bottle, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He had no idea if she was right, but her confidence unnerved him. He had built his career on bluffing and bluster, and he recognized a move that had just topped his. But his ego would not allow him to concede. He had to destroy her. "That is the most absurd, pretentious nonsense I have ever heard," he bellowed, recovering his rage. "She's making it up. She read it on Wikipedia. Davies, I am not just a customer here. I am a stakeholder in this city. My patronage keeps places like this afloat, and I am telling you to fire this insolent little girl right now, or I will make it my personal mission to see that the Gilded Quill is shuttered within a year. I will buy the building, I will gut it, and I will turn it into luxury condos. Do you understand me?" The threat was real. The air grew thick with menace. Mr. Davies, trembling, turned to Ilara. "Ilara, you are fired. Please, gather your things and leave. You have caused an unforgivable disturbance." "She will do no such thing." The voice came from the corner booth. It was not loud, but it carried an astonishing weight, a calm, resonant authority that cut through Blackwood's blustering rage like a surgeon's scalpel. Every head in the room turned. The quiet man, the tourist, was standing up. Julian Croft was not a physically imposing man. He was of medium height, slender, with thinning grey hair and a face that was more thoughtful than handsome. He wore a simple grey suit that was well made but utterly unremarkable. He looked like an accountant or a history professor. He did not look like the most powerful person in the room. He walked slowly toward the table, his footsteps making no sound on the thick Persian rug. He stopped beside Elara, creating a small, defiant island of two in the sea of hostility. "Who the hell are you?" Blackwood demanded, irritated by this new interruption. "The manager of the Holiday Inn? This doesn't concern you. Get back to your table." Julian Croft ignored him. He looked at Elara, and for the first time, a small, weary smile touched his lips. "Miss Vance, is it?" Elara nodded, her heart hammering. "You've been reading," he said. It wasn't a question. "The archives? My grandfather's journals. The public library has digital copies," she whispered. "I read them on my breaks." Croft nodded slowly. "My grandfather would have liked you." He then turned his attention to the bottle on the table. He picked it up, his movements gentle and precise. He examined the capsule, then tilted the bottle to look at the ullage, the space between the wine and the cork. Finally, his gaze fell on a tiny, almost invisible scratch on the punt, the indentation at the base of the bottle. He looked at Dubois, the sommelier, who was now sweating profusely. "Mr. Dubois," Croft said, his voice dangerously soft, "where did this specific bottle come from?" "From the cellar, Monsieur Croft," Dubois stammered, his face ashen. He had recognized him. "From the main vault." "No, it didn't," Croft said simply. He ran his thumb over the scratch. "This bottle came from the secondary cellar, the one we use for functions. It's from a case of 1982 Mouton Rothschild that we purchased at auction 10 years ago. An excellent vintage, worth about $2,000 a bottle, but not 20,000. This scratch was made when a clumsy sommelier, you, I believe, dropped the case while unloading it. I made a note of it in the inventory log myself." The confession, delivered with such surgical coldness, was devastating. Dubois looked like he was about to collapse. Croft then turned to Mr. Davies. "And you, Mr. Davies, you knew, didn't you? You knew our one authentic bottle of the 45 was sold in a private transaction to a collector in Hong Kong 6 months ago to cover a budget shortfall. A shortfall created by your own mismanagement. You approved the sale and deliberately failed to update the wine list, hoping no one would ever call your bluff. Tonight, someone did. So you panicked. You sent Mr. Dubois to fetch a convincing-looking substitute, hoping Mr. Blackwood's palate was as unsophisticated as his manners. The silence in the room was now absolute, a vacuum of shock and humiliation. Mr. Davies's mouth opened and closed like a fish, but no sound emerged. Finally, Croft turned his gaze to Sterling Blackwood. The developer's face, once ruddy with rage, was now a pasty, doughy white. The shark had been defanged. "Mr. Blackwood," Julian Croft said, his voice dropping the last few degrees into ice. "My name is Julian Croft. My grandfather built this restaurant. I own the building you're sitting in. I own the chair you're sitting on, the glass in your hand, and the fraudulent wine you've been praising with such authority." He paused, letting the weight of his words. He placed the bottle gently back on the table, the clink of glass on linen, a sound as final as a gavel strike. Miss Vance was not just protecting the reputation of my restaurant. She was protecting you from confirming, in the most public way imaginable, that you are a fraud. A man of cheap taste, cheap manners, and no substance. You are the very definition of new money, with all of the money and none of the class. Croft's voice never rose, yet each word landed with the percussive force of a body blow. The air in the room had become thin, unbreathable. The meal, of course, is on the house. I would not dream of charging you for this humiliation. However, your presence is no longer required. Not tonight. Not ever. You are permanently banned from this establishment. Should you attempt to enter again, you will be removed as a trespasser. Now, he paused, his gaze as cold and hard as polished granite. Get out of my restaurant. For a full 10 seconds, Sterling Blackwood didn't move. He seemed to be processing a language he had never heard before. The language of absolute, non-negotiable dismissal. His face, which had cycled through rage and pallor, now settled on a mask of grotesque disbelief. He, Sterling Blackwood, who moved markets and reshaped skylines, was being told to leave. The conqueror was being evicted. A primal, wounded noise escaped his throat, a guttural sound of pure ego death. You can't, he stammered, his voice a pathetic rasp. Do you know who I am? I know precisely who you are, Croft replied, his tone unchanged. You are a man who is 5 seconds away from being physically escorted from the premises. I would advise against making that necessary. The optics would be unfortunate for your brand. The mention of his brand, the carefully constructed edifice of power and success, was the final, fatal thrust. He looked at Tiffany. Her face was a sculpture of glacial contempt. She had already detached, her mind miles away, calculating the damage, composing the text that would end their engagement. She gathered her microscopic purse, the metallic click of its clasp echoing in the tomb-like silence. Sterling, she said, her voice sharp and brittle, you are an embarrassment. She didn't wait for him. She rose, her posture impossibly straight, and walked towards the exit, a stiletto-heeled retreat from a catastrophic merger. That broke him. Without his audience, without his beautiful, vapid validation, he was nothing. A hollow man in an expensive suit. He pushed his chair back with a violent scrape, the noise ugly and jarring in the sanctified quiet. He did not look at Croft. He did not look at Elara. He stared at the half-empty bottle of fraudulent wine, the symbol of his utter humiliation. Then, with a jerky, uncoordinated movement, he turned and lumbered towards the door, his shoulders slumped in a way that seemed to physically diminish his stature. The entire dining room watched his retreat. It was not a walk of shame. It was a funeral procession for a man's vanity. The heavy oak door swung shut behind him, and the oppressive spell was broken. A collective sighing breath seemed to ripple through the room. The string quartet, after a moment's hesitation, began to play again, a soft, tentative piece by Satie that felt like a gentle balm on a fresh wound. Diners turned back to their plates, their hushed conversations now filled with the electric thrill of witnessed drama. But for Elara, the world had shrunk to the space between heartbeats. The adrenaline that had been a roaring furnace in her veins now turned to ice water. Her legs, which had held her ramrod straight through the entire ordeal, suddenly felt like overcooked pasta. The room tilted slightly, the glittering chandelier blurring into a smear of light. Julian Croft's hand gently touched her elbow, steadying her. "Breathe, Miss Vance," he said softly, his voice, now devoid of its icy command, replaced by a quiet concern. "The dragon has been slain. You can lower your shield." He then turned his attention to the two men who remained, frozen in a tableau of disgrace. Mr. Davies's face was the color of tallow, his eyes wide with a terror that went beyond mere job loss. Mr. Dubois was visibly trembling, his carefully cultivated Gallic poise shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. "Gentlemen," Croft said, and the steel returned to his voice, though it was now tempered with a weary disappointment. "My office. Tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. I suggest you do not arrive together." He did not need to elaborate. The quiet, individual summons was more terrifying than any public excoriation. They both gave jerky, puppet-like nods and began a slow, shambling retreat towards the kitchen, their careers and reputations dissolving with every step. The stage was finally clear. There was only the table, the offending bottle, and the two people who understood its true story. "Please," Croft said, gesturing not to Blackwood's chair, but to the more intimate seat beside it, the one Tiffany had abandoned. "Sit down before you fall down." Elara obeyed, sinking into the plush velvet. The exhaustion that hit her was profound, a bone-deep weariness that came from waging a war she never intended to fight. Croft sat opposite her. He did not speak for a long moment. He simply regarded her, his expression a complex mixture of admiration, curiosity, and a deep, resonant sadness. He picked up the bottle of 1982 Mouton and poured a small amount into a clean glass. He swirled it, inhaled its bouquet, and then pushed it across the table toward her. "Go on," he urged. "You've earned it. Tell me what you taste." Her hand shook as she lifted the glass. The wine's aroma was rich and complex. Dark fruit, leather, wet earth. She took a small, hesitant sip. It was magnificent, powerful, elegant, with a long, lingering finish. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "But it's not history. It's a memory." A slow smile spread across Julian Croft's face. It transformed him, erasing the weary weight from his eyes. "A memory." "Precisely. My grandfather used to say the great wines tell a story. The good ones, like this, tell you about a perfect summer. The legendary ones, the true ones, tell you about a world recovering from a war." He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "You weren't defending a bottle of wine tonight, were you, Miss Vance?" The question caught her off guard. She looked down at her hands, twisting a napkin in her lap. "No," she admitted. I don't know. I felt like he was burning a book in a library. He wasn't just drinking it, he was mocking it. He was mocking the idea that anything could have value beyond its price tag. This place. She trailed off, searching for the words. "This place is real. The wood is real. The history is real. It survived for over a century because it has substance." He was an absence, a void, and he was trying to make this place as empty as he is. The confession tumbled out of her, raw and unplanned. She was no longer a waitress. She was a young woman defending the very last bastion of authenticity she had ever known. Croft listened, his gaze intent, his head tilted slightly, as if he were trying to solve a complex and beautiful puzzle. "The soul of the building," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "For months, I've been walking through these halls feeling like a ghost in my own home. I've watched the new breed of customer come in, men like Blackwood, who treat the staff like furniture and the menu like a scorecard. They don't come here to dine, they come here to conquer, to plant a flag. I feared the soul had already fled." He met her eyes. "And then I saw you, standing there, armed with nothing but the truth. You were more a part of this place than I am." "I just work here," she said, the ingrained humility of her position rising to the surface. "No," he countered firmly. "You don't just work here. You understand here. There's a profound difference. Tell me, Elara, may I call you Elara, Where does a history major from Hunter College learn to identify the alloy composition of post-war bottle capsules? And so, in the hushed, gilded sanctuary of the dining room, she told him. She spoke of her 60-hour work weeks, of the crushing weight of student debt that felt like a physical presence on her shoulders. She told him about her 30-minute breaks, spent not on her phone, but in the cramped, windowless locker room, devouring digitized copies of his grandfather's journals, of auction catalogues from the 1920s, of treatises on viticulture. She explained that she wasn't just memorizing facts for a class. She was inhaling a different world, a world of substance and narrative that felt more real to her than her own precarious existence. This restaurant wasn't just a job, it was her research library, her sanctuary, the only beautiful thing in her life that she was allowed to touch. He listened without interruption, his patience a gift. He did not condescend or praise her with empty platitudes. He listened with the focused intensity of a scholar recognizing a peer. When she finished, the silence that followed was comfortable, filled with a new, unspoken understanding. My grandfather Alistair was a ruthless man in many ways, Croft said, his voice soft with reminiscence. A titan of industry. But his one true passion was preservation. He believed that the story of humanity wasn't just written in books, but was baked into bricks, woven into carpets, and bottled in cellars. He built this place as a living archive of taste and time. He would have been horrified by what Davies and Dubois did, but he would have been incandescently proud of you. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, at the dark wood and the gleaming silver, seeing it all through new eyes. For the past 10 years, I've been trying to run the Gilded Quill as a business. I've been focused on profit margins, on overhead, on brand management. I've been trying to keep the body alive. I forgot that my primary duty was to protect its soul. He leaned back, a decision solidifying in his eyes. This is why I must make you a proposal, and I must ask you to consider it not as a reward for an evening's work, but as a response to a lifetime of passion. Ilara's heart began to beat, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The position of general manager is, for obvious reasons, about to be vacant, he continued. I do not want to offer you that job. A manager's duty is to the present. Your gift is your connection to the past and your vision for its future. I want to create a new position, a role that should have existed all along. Curator and historian of the Gilded Quill. He let the words hang in the air. Curator. Historian. Titles from her dreams, spoken aloud in this impossible reality. Your responsibilities would be threefold, he went on, his voice gaining energy. First, preservation. You would have ultimate authority over the wine cellar, the archives, the art, and the historical integrity of the building. No bottle will be sold, no chair reupholstered, without your approval. Second, education. You will retrain the entire staff, from the dishwashers to the sommeliers. You will teach them the stories you know, so that every employee becomes a guardian of this legacy, not just a servant. Third, curation. You will work with the chef to develop menus inspired by our history. You will host lectures. You will manage our cultural presence. You will be the keeper of the flame. He named a salary that was so far beyond her comprehension that it sounded like a random sequence of numbers. Her mind struggled to process it. And one more thing, he added, his expression serious. The Croft Foundation was established to preserve cultural history. I can think of no better investment than in a person who embodies that mission. The foundation will grant you a full, unconditional scholarship to complete your bachelor's degree, and your master's and your doctorate, should you choose to pursue them. Your only obligation will be to bring what you learn back within these walls. We do not invest in balance sheets, Alara. We invest in guardians. The tears came then. Not the hot tears of fear, or the bitter tears of humiliation, but a silent, overwhelming flood of disbelief and gratitude. It was a current of emotion so powerful, it felt like it was washing away years of struggle, of feeling unseen and unheard. Every late night in the library, every sacrifice, every moment she had felt that her passion was a useless, esoteric indulgence. It had all been leading to this. Her knowledge wasn't a hobby. It was her armor, her weapon, and now her salvation. She could only nod, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. He understood. He simply pushed the crystal water glass towards her and waited. 1 year later, the light in the gilded quill was different, or perhaps Ilara was seeing it differently. The late afternoon sun, filtered through the newly cleaned arched windows, cast long, golden shafts across the dining room, illuminating the motes of dust that danced in the air like tiny historical spirits. The room was empty, poised in the sacred hush before service. Ilara Vance stood by table 12, not with a notepad, but with a small, leather-bound book. She wore a tailored wool blazer, her movements filled with a quiet, earned authority. She was showing a new hire, a young waiter named Leo, with earnest, nervous eyes, the intricate marquetry on the wall panel beside the booth. "This is rosewood and satinwood," she explained, her voice soft but clear. "The inlay depicts the Hudson River Valley. If you look closely, you can see the artist included a tiny steamboat. It was a gift to Alistair Croft from a cabinet maker whose business he saved during the Panic of 1907. It's not just decoration. It's a story about gratitude." Leo stared at the panel, his mouth slightly agape. "Wow, I just thought it was a pattern." "Nothing in here is just a pattern," Ilara said with a smile. "Everything has a story. And now you're one of the storytellers." That had been the essence of her work. She had transformed the staff from automatons into custodians. They knew the provenance of the bar, the ghost of the opera singer who haunted the wine cellar, the reason the house steak sauce recipe had remained unchanged since 1912. Morale was no longer an issue. It had been replaced by a fierce, collective pride. Julian Croft emerged from his office, which he now used only a few times a week, having entrusted the daily soul of the place to her. He carried a bottle, its shape unmistakable, and 2 delicate coupe glasses. "I was going through my grandfather's private reserve," he said, his eyes twinkling. "I found this, a 1921 Pole Roger, bottled the year before my father was born. I thought it appropriate for your anniversary." He opened the ancient champagne with a barely audible sigh. It poured with a gentle, pale gold effervescence. He handed her a glass. "To the curator?" he toasted, his voice filled with genuine warmth and respect. "To the guardians," she replied, clinking her glass against his. The champagne tasted of brioche, dried apples, and a faint, saline minerality. It tasted of time itself. As she drank, she thought of the fates of the other players in that drama. Davies had been reassigned to an accounting role in Croft's real estate division, where his obsession with numbers was an asset, not a liability. He was, by all accounts, quietly content. Dubois had vanished from the culinary world, his confidence and credibility shattered. And Sterling Blackwood? 6 months ago, a small article in the financial section had detailed the final auction of his company's assets. The last lot mentioned was his extensive wine collection, which a court-appointed appraiser had discovered was composed of over 60% forgeries, impressive fakes purchased to impress people who, like him, knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. He was a punchline, a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. He had not lost his fortune because of one bad night. He had lost it because the knighthood revealed the truth that had been there all along. His entire empire was as hollow as his character. "Are you happy, Alara?" Julian asked, his question simple and direct. She looked around the magnificent room, her archive, her home. She thought of her classes, where she now spoke with the confidence of a practitioner, not just a student. She thought of the weightless feeling of studying without the crushing burden of debt. "I'm more than happy," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she could now easily name. "I'm home." She had learned that night a year ago that true power was not the ability to shout, to demand, to conquer. It was the quiet, unshakable strength that came from knowing a thing, truly and deeply, from its surface to its soul. The world would always have its sterling Blackwoods, loud, empty vessels making the most noise. But the enduring light, the thing that survived wars and recessions, and the endless parade of frauds, was always tended by the quiet guardians, the keepers of the stories. And she was one of them now. The flame was safe in her hands.